Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Suessa fought in 340 BC between a Roman Samnitic coalition, strange couple, against the Latins. And it's a fascinating event that we know fundamentally just through Livy. We know Diodorus actually talked about it, so it confirms the event, but it's fundamentally Livy. Book 8, chapters from 6 to 11, that today we will fundamentally read and comment, because as we will see, for a battle video, the information, even just to reconstruct what would tactically happen with finesse, is not much possible. Here we're talking naturally of a late Republican, early imperial source that is describing something that happens in this moment of Roman, we can't say properly Roman history, right? Before 270 BC, Roman history is history / myth, right? Of course, towards the 4th century, in the closer times, it's more reliable, let's say, but we can't see through the thing clearly and getting too many details from it. This would require an important digression that we have already addressed here and there, especially in the videos about Roman archaic warfare. So we are in an interesting time in Roman history because, and this is also why this battle is famous through Livy's account, because for this clash, Livy illustrates the structure of what would have been, according to him, which is not the truth, but sometimes not even reality proper. At 340 BC Roman legion, and without too much digressions even in here, we just stressed that this is fundamentally the moment of gestation, creation of what will be known as a Roman manipular legion, that the same Livy describes for the end, the last decades of the 4th century BC, now in its complete form as we know it during the 3rd century. But at this point, important things were changing, right? And were still being transformed. We have talked about the Genesis manipular tactics, which is a hot, fascinating topic, I would say, because if anything, historiography has at this point explained to us pretty concretely that this change, this transformation, is something that happened within properly the Roman political and social system. No, the manipular legion is not born out of, for example, of any phalanx. The Romans never adopted Greek phalanx, and no people except the Greeks, and we could go as far as saying literally just the Spartans and the Athenians adopted the classical political phalanx as we know it stereotypically, right? The rest was absolutely nothing like that, and this is pretty well known to anybody who is acquainted to the updated literature. But also, it wasn't made specifically just by the Samnitic Wars and or other, or let's say better, an adaptation to other people's warfare. This was basically the Romans trying to fix things within their own military system, independently from whom they met. This is something, okay, we will need to address really in another video, because it's too much. I made a video on Roman archaic warfare that actually takes into consideration mostly 4th century warfare, so if you are interested in these topics and you've never listened to this stuff, you can check that. That is the most complete thing I've done so far about it, but I will possibly even soon, I don't know, make some videos about this, at least 2 or 3 videos to explain how the manipular tactics was born and how we think it functioned, because generally speaking we have no clue, and this is also universally renowned by anybody who is acquainted to the sources. That is, we know an astonishingly few about how the Roman army was and how it actually fought. But I won't start my usual rant against mechanistic, modernistic prejudices, because otherwise we really don't end this. But so I would say Livy's description of this 340 BC legion is punctual, right? He's trying to make sense of the system in a way, but naturally it is unreliable, right? Some of you will be impressed by the fact that Livy states openly that before that time the Roman legion was, as he says, similar. He doesn't even say like, but similar to the early Macedonian phalanx that might have been the early, even pre Philip II's time. So it's very complex to actually to draw parallelisms. The Romans were writing at that point, Livy was writing at that point of Roman history where lots of things had gone on. We're talking about literally 3 centuries and a half distance from these events. So with a level of documentation was rather, complex but still poor overall. Livy is openly trying to make sense of it. That is to say, according to me, or what is written, what is recorded, etc. But there are huge philological problems that, however, get mostly down to the fact that, of course, Livy didn't understand much of that reality, like probably not many Romans themselves at that point. The relatively the one he's describing, I mean. And also, the mechanism, the tactics, as we will see, of this early proto, we could say at this point, manipular legion are imprecise. That is to say, they do not actually demonstrate a good nothing about, for example, the actual spaces between the various units. That is a big deal for so many people. Instead, is definitely overrated. Or how maniples swap the lines, mostly alternate and all this stuff. But let's repeat it. The same Livian text doesn't actually tell us in detail how it worked, because things can there are hypotheses how this works. I will illustrate them at some point, but they're just hypotheses. It's not that a source says actually something, but no source actually says what actually happened, nor when, as we will see now today from the text, because it basically says that these lines were slowly withdrew after they had to be substituted to the line in the back, and would enter into the gaps existing eventually in these manifolds that formed it. Right? It literally says this. And not much more. And the way it could happen could be very varying in degrees. That is to say, we don't even know whether this happened, with the actual cohesion of the various units that compose the line, and this is not even important in a way. It's still interesting though, because it shows this, let's say, the graduality, the gestation of the manipular tactics that didn't happen from a day to another. It took probably something like a few less than a century to be actually completed, and probably with a lot of back and forth, etc. We have just to accept that this is not a scientific description. This is just basically the best that Livy could make in his mind with the sources he had, and not even being particularly, and rightfully, by the way, interested in the actual mechanism, how this happened, or whether the sources told him actually this, or whether he was inventing also a bit, because that's Livy, he makes mistakes, as we will see. Also the location of the battle, and then many people in fact find, even I've seen on Wikipedia, that it's called the Battle of Mons Vesuvius, because Livy actually mistakes what other scholars have probably rightly identified in this volcano close to Rocca Monfina that Livy probably exchanged for the Vesuvius. This battle took place in Campania, but near Capo, but in this locality of Suessa that has nothing to do with the Vesuvius, right? If not with this other next volcano. The Vesuvius is several tens of kilometers away. But that is just for saying, the banality of the mistakes, at which level they can reach. But once again, you don't read a classical text thinking that that's the problem. If you do it like that, you have a problem like a modern-minded person. What actually is fascinating about these chapters, and in fact we'll read from way before the beginning of the battle even, that tactically speaking is relatively simple, is important details, anecdotes, for example, about the devotio. I will use the restituta pronunciation today, so if I don't speak in ecclesiastical, you will forgive me. The importance of cavalry warfare among the Italic peoples, things like these, that are perhaps in themselves more important than the technical problem how a Roman legion at this time would actually work. So we will simply read and comment along the way, because I think this is the best way of doing it. So here we are, Livy 8:7, and this is when the Latins basically sent this representative to Rome, to essentially declare war against the Romans, because the Latins had now were gaining confidence about their strength. They wanted to share with Rome the benefits on equal, the Republic of the Empire on equal ground, whatever. Yes, I say empire because it's technically the imperium. It has nothing to do with the empire in Victorian terms as we intend the Roman Empire today. But we already explained this. So without much further ado, I talk too much. Let's let Livy talk. Livy 8:5, actually. So, on their arrival in Rome, the Latins, the Senate has assembled in the capital and granted them an audience. Manlius, the consul, acting on the instructions of the Senate, recommended them not to make war upon the Samnites, with whom the Romans had a treaty, on which Annius, that is the Latin representative, as though he were a conqueror who had captured the capital by arms instead an ambassador protected by the law of nations, said. So this is taking place in the capital. And the Latin ambassador speaks as, "It is about time, Titus Manlius and senators, that you gave up treating us, the Latins, as though you were our suzerains, when you see the state of Latium raised by the bounty of the gods to a most flourishing position, both in population and in military power, the Samnites defeated the Sidicines and Campanians in alliance with us, and even with the Volscians, now making common cause with us, whilst your own colonies actually prefer the government of Latium to that of Rome. But since you cannot bring your minds to abandon your impudent claims to sovereignty, we will go so far in recognizing that we are kindred nations as to offer peace upon the conditions of equal rights for both, since it has pleased the gods to grant equal strength to both. Though we are quite able to assert the independence of Latium by force of arms, one consul must be elected from Rome, the other from Latium. The Senate must contain an equal number of members from both nations. There must be one nation, one republic. And in order that there may be one seat of government and one name for all, since one side or the other must take some concession, let us, if this city really takes precedence, be all called Romans." So naturally this is interesting because it's Livy thinking about what the Latins eventually, also in later history, that Latins were, the Romans actually fought against the Latin League and so on, like in this case, but they were fundamentally allies. They were first allies of the Romans, the ones properly of the Tiber Valley, that over time, differently from the rest of the Italics that were mostly used just in military terms, like also military colonies sent also on the frontier in provinces, etc., would gain this more privileged status, mostly an economical, with a lot of benefits because also Latin cities were rich and so on. And so Livy naturally speaks from, also the pride of the Latins in that regard. But of course, Rome was preceding. Latin citizenship was not Roman citizenship. And at least, we're talking still about the times being. But then Livy says, it so happened that the Romans had in their consul Malnius a man who was quite as proud and passionate as Annius. He was so enraged as to declare that if the Senate were visited by such madness as to accept these conditions from a man from Setia, he would come with his sword drawn into the Senate house and kill every Latin he found there. Then, turning to the image of Jupiter, he exclaimed, "O Jupiter, these abominable words! Hear them, O justice and right. Thou, Jupiter, as though thou hadst been conquered and made captive, art to see in thy temple foreign consuls and a foreign senate. Were these the terms of the treaty, Latins, which Tullus, the king of Rome, made with your fathers of Alba, or which Tarquin made with you afterwards? Have you forgotten the battle at Lake Regillus? Are you so utterly oblivious of your defeats in the old days and of our kindness towards you? This outburst was followed by the indignant protest of the Senate, and it is recorded that whilst on all hands appeals were being made to the gods, whom the consuls were continually invoking as the guardians of treaties, the voice of Annius was heard pouring contempt upon the divine majesty of the Jupiter of Rome. At all events, when in a storm of passion he was flinging himself out of the vestibule of the temple, he slipped down the steps and struck his head so heavily against the bottom step that he became unconscious. The authorities are not agreed as to whether he was actually killed, and I leave the question undecided, as also the statement that during the appeals to the gods to avenge the breach of treaties, a storm burst from the sky with a terrific roar, for they may either be true or simply invented as an appropriate representation of the wrath of the gods. Torquatus was sent by the Senate to conduct the envoys away, and when he saw Annius lying on the ground, he exclaimed loud enough to be heard by the senators and the populace alike, "It is well, the gods have commenced a just and righteous war. There is a divine power at work, thou, O great Jupiter, art here. Not in vain have we consecrated this to be thine abode, O Father of gods and men. Why do you hesitate, Quirites, and you, senators, to take up arms when the gods are your leaders? I will lay the legions of the Latins low, just as you, their envoy, lying here." This is just for those who think that in paganism there were not wars of religion. In this sense, the consul words were received by the people with loud applause, and raised them to such a pitch of excitement that when the envoys took their departure, they owed their safety more to the care of the magistrates, who, on the consul's order, accompanied them to protect them from the attacks of the angry people than to any respect felt for the law of nations. War having been decided upon by Senate as much as people, the consuls enrolled 2 armies and proceeded through the territories of the Marsi and the Paeligni, where they were joined by an army of Samnites. They fixed their camp at Capua, where the Latins and their allies had assembled. It is said that whilst they were there, each consul had the same vision in the quiet of the night. A form greater and more awful than any human form appeared to them, and announced that the commander of the one army and the army itself on the other side were destined as a sacrifice to the Manes and to Mother Earth. In whichever army the commander should have devoted the legions of his enemies and himself as well as those deities, to those deities, that army, that people would have the victory. When the consuls compared these visions of the night together, they decided that victims should be slain to avert the wrath of the gods, and further, that if on inspection they should portend the same as the vision had announced, one of the 2 consuls should fulfill his destiny. When the answers of the soothsayers, after they had inspected the victims, proved to correspond with their own secret belief in the vision, they called up the superior officers and told them to explain publicly to the soldiers what the gods had decreed, in order that the voluntary death of a consul might not create a panic in the army. They arranged with each other that when either division began to give way, the consul in command should devote himself on behalf of the Roman people and the Quirites. The council of war were also decided that if ever any war had been conducted with the strict enforcement of orders, on this occasion certainly military discipline should be brought back to the ancient standards. Their anxiety was increased by the fact that it was against the Latins that they had to fight, a people resembling them in language, manners, arms, and especially in their military organization. They had been colleagues and comrades as soldiers, centurions, and tribunes, often stationed together in the same posts and side by side in the same manifolds. That this might not prove a source of error and confusions, orders were given that no one was to leave his post to fight the enemy. Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. Naturally, this last lines are a bit echoing Livy's times, the civil wars of the late Republic, the idea also, other sources, other episodes, the same Livy actually when talking about the Second Punic War, when the Italics had been integrated into the Roman army, they were indistinguishable from the Roman legionnaires. So strengthening this idea that it was a civil strife in a sense, so that not only they mostly knew each other, but they also fought in the same way. And this is actually realistic even for the times being. The Samnites might have actually fought in a slightly different fashion, but even in here, differentiating Italic warfare at this point, especially by 304, is not a great idea. But surely, there were some differences. But what is fascinating, and that gives us, further food for thought, given that, especially about a topic that it's kind of dear to us. I mean, the fact that how quickly the Romans rose from a tribal feudal state to basically, a centralized power, etc., and is the difficulty that is very well exemplified by these episodes, and especially ahead you will see it, of the enormous effort that the Romans made to transform Italic warriors that were individualistic, alt-headed, like any warrior, into disciplined, drilled soldiers, right? That actually in Italic, in Roman warfare, did maintain their own individualism. The Roman legionnaire is preferably apt fighting in formation, but it's absolutely able to fight in single combat as well, and his equipment and gear, even just throughout all the following centuries, actually reflects it pretty damn well. And here, when Livy says that this might not prove a source of error or confusion, I mean, the fact that Romans and Latins here, by fighting one against the other, might have confused who was who. Orders were given that no one was to leave his post to fight with the enemy, which goes in parallel also to what he said before, that ancient discipline had to be resumed. So here there is an acknowledgement from Livy that fundamentally discipline had, of course, changed over time, that there were certain things that were used to do before, others not. Here, whatever, it's not important because there are other references that we can't discuss, but this last information, then what nobody had to leave his post to fight with the enemy, tells us that probably by the 4th century BC, still, the Romans did on a regular base, right? That is to say, naturally, we're used to think of the Romans as the perfectly drilled, perfectly, unmovable, kind of cold fires would neither abandon their post. But actually, this warfare, but also the one of the later centuries, was still about a great deal of individualism in a sense, and these were still borderline, warriors in a sense that would simply launch themselves, as we'll see better now, individually minded against the enemy, and even achieving a big deal because they were capable of doing it, because they were warriors, because they were coming from largely a substantially tribal background, in a sense. And this is true, of course, the Romans were the most, here Livy also says the Latins were kind of better at fighting in a sense, in terms of strength, actually. So this tells the Romans might have been the most gentrified, the Latins still less, the Samnites were wilder, naturally, but they're all part of a, of a context that naturally didn't differ extremely much. Some here, you find here also topoi, but it is important because, incidentally, as we were saying before, this is moment of transformation, of creation of the manipular legion. That wasn't always like that, also when it came to completion, let's say, by the end of the 4th century BC, but, it would achieve full maturity just 1 century afterwards in terms of actual, capacities, cohesion, maneuverability, and collective training, because that's fundamentally how it was. So this is still a relatively archaic time, where we see a lot of these references about individualistic-minded warriors that were in a sense praised by the Romans. We will see why, because instinctively we all like the warrior best. We just don't understand that, in front of a soldier, he's done for, given what the soldier is part of and what the warrior is part of. And this is, I know that there are lots of people who reject this because they've been, kind of almost infatuated with the bullshit that, our modern military is about warriors, and there are elect people, there are warriors and make a war done. No, that's culturalist bullshit. It has nothing to do with actual military history. And it's a very much more complicated thing than it seems. But properly, as we were saying before, it took really an important amount of time to discipline these legionnaires within the same legion that naturally already existed. It was not just in the manipular form, but the latter entailed some higher degree of collective discipline. Of discipline and collective training, and therefore an ever greater control of the state. It was capable of delivering this discipline the harsh way that we know the Romans had, and to make naturally their armies more effective. But it wasn't like that. And these heroic figures in the Roman past, as we were saying before, this is it's borderline history, right? It's half myth, half history, and still the Romans had their own sagas, right? The Roman, just like I don't know why we decided to erase this in popular culture, this idea that the Romans were fundamentally identical to any other tribal people that in Europe, with all the same symbols, literally at all levels of religion, of moral standards, etc. We'll make a video on this, but unfortunately 19th century racism and positivism and modernism has to make us believe that these were kind of a 19th century centralized state versus the free hippies of the north, right? But I don't even say how ridiculous these ideas are. The Romans had their own sagas, they had their own heroes, and the whole ethos was revolving around individual combat, even more mounted combat, right? The Romans, contrarily to what is commonly believed, were obsessed with cavalry, and basically all the heroes in Roman history are horsemen. And there is no other way around this, just like all in the Indo-European, say, myth and history in practice. But this is, the illusion is the fact that, we are reading Livy now, right? So we read the stuff from a moment in which Rome was more civilized, and therefore it seemed, to a superficial eye that, it's as if the Romans had already been like that, right? And therefore we get tricked just by a banal historical perspective, whereas the Romans were just basically the same of other peoples that just were eventually documented later by more civilized ones, like the Romans, talking about the Celts or the Germans, and therefore, stereotyping the Germans or the Celts just the way the Romans told us they were, also because the Romans literally, and the Greeks invented even the fact that such names existed as such, identities existed as such, and we're just living through what the Roman says, including the myth of the good savage, of the noble barbarian, and all this stuff, and it's dramatically fascinating set to read through the same Roman literature these obvious references to heroic figures that in a way could have not been but such, right? But that still were sacrificed in front of what now began to matter was real discipline, real control, real political authority. That is effectively what makes a civilization. Makes from a moral life simply things better. And if one doesn't really start from this standpoint, doesn't even understand why Rome, that was just like another center whatsoever, actually built an empire, and other tribes didn't. It's not that the Romans had an empire incorporated; they were actually believing through the imperium the same thing that everybody believed universally at the time. The only difference is that they made it, and today we don't explain how, but also surely did pass through this collective discipline and authority. So, and here, in fact, we get to the juicy part of the story. It is before the battle, a combat on horseback between the son of the consul Titus Manlius and the Latin Geminus Maecius. That, as you will see, will show the inescapability of the tragic death of the hero, just like in the Norse sagas, etc. The hero is the hero, but always dies badly, exactly because he's a hero, right? And whereas more advanced mindset goes on, even in the harshness of it, and gets things done. And this is the great moral, of course, that emerges from this Roman stories, naturally written, as we were saying, much later. So from a more enlightened standpoint, and so Livy says, amongst the troop commanders who had been sent out everywhere to reconnoitre, there happened to be Manlius, the consul's son. He had ridden out with his men by the enemy's camp and was hardly a stone's throw from their nearest post, where the Tusculan cavalry were stationed. When Geminus Maecius was in command, a man of high reputation among his own people recognized the Roman cavalry and the consul's son at their head, for they were all, especially the men of distinction, known to each other. Right? So this is typically clanic society where naturally they, as Romans and Latins, that knew each other, who were the most important men. This was son of a consul. These were important families, and that were all naturally also devoted to war in this regard. What is this? This is essentially a raid close to the enemy camp, right, or a recognition, but still, an act of bravery. And as we will see, in fact, maybe the recognition was actually ordered, but not the ensuing fight. And this, these guys take matters in their own hands. They were horsemen, right? And so it's important that also such an important figure would go into this operation, right? That tells you how close we are here to, normally you send scouts, even, throw away troops. Like here, there is the son of the council in it. So it's a much more warlike, individualistic, charismatic context, typical of a warlike society. And this Latin leader recognizes Manlius. In fact, Livy writes, accosting Manlius, he said, "Are you going to conduct the war against the Latins and their allies with that single troop of yours? What will their two armies be doing in the meantime?" "They will be here in good time," Manlius replied, "and so will Jupiter, the great and powerful, the witness of your breach of faith. If we fought at Lake Regillus till you had quite enough, certainly we shall succeed here also in preventing you from finding too much pleasure in meeting us in battle." But Battle of Lake Regillus was important Latin defeat. At the end of the Romans, they had sanctioned Roman preeminence. So here, the memories of military events echoing and so on, in this great ferocious competition between the two, as you understand. Here, it's important to stress the religious issue. The Latins had offended the Roman Jupiter, because, by the way, the Latins believed in their own Jupiter as well. There were, other sanctuaries, etc. So it was really, this tells you pretty well how also in paganism everybody fought in the name of literally, fighting in the name of God is not a monotheistic invention. Every single people in the history of religion fought in the name of God, right? Everybody. You couldn't go at war if you didn't make a sacrifice, if you didn't think God was on your side. So this is just for explaining where we come from universally, right? And how this also had a very important role and meaning and actual purpose in those societies, and even further ahead in, monotheistic times, the Crusades, the Jihads, whatever. So Livy says, in reply, Geminus rode forward a short distance and said, "Are you willing, before the day comes when you are to set your armies in motion for so great an effort, to have a meeting with me, that the result of our single combat may show how much a Latin horseman is superior to a Roman?" Right, so this is definitely a challenge to single combat between two horsemen. Right, so a Latin horseman is superior to a Roman one. This is what these people had in their minds, right? The idea, even if it's just Livy writing it much later, this is what they remembered. They perfectly knew about Roman military ethics. They were horsemen. A true warrior is a horseman. Like, in all Indo-European society, even up to the places where was least cavalry, look at the Vandal horsemen, look at everywhere. The freeman is technically a horseman by duty and privilege, right? It's not a surprise that the Romans, even in their most republican phase, would still have a body of knights actually paid by the state, which was an interior contradiction to the idea that the citizen has to pay for his own equipment to participate to the army as a duty and a honor, right? That was even more. It was a privilege, and knights, whatever, but you actually know this if you have an idea of what archaic Roman warfare was actually. It was simply a feudal society. I mean, not kidding. These were clans with, fighting in the same minds, the same ideas. Livy continues, says, either urged on by anger or feeling ashamed to decline the contest or dragged on by the irresistible power of destiny. Do you realize what Livy says here? This is basically like this is Siegfried, right? The irresistible power of destiny. This thing had to happen. It was something that could not be avoided. You see, here there's not the secularized idea that it was a choice. Yes, in theory it was a choice, and everything is a choice, but certain things are just meant to happen because God's wanting them, because there is a purpose, even through the death of this valorous nobleman. So it was surely anger, etc. So, of course, Livy stresses the fact that this guy, at the end of the day, was indisciplined, right? But this indiscipline was still liked, probably by the Roman audience in Livy's time, as an act of, of nobility. This idea of courage, the idea that a Roman cannot deny, a challenge. You cannot refuse a challenge to single combat, right? He has to do it because at that point he's being called. It's his honor. So, yes, he will create a problem, but for the others as well. This is the value of collective responsibility and discipline and so on. But still, hey, he's a Roman, and he has to be the hero of the situation. The tragic hero, doesn't matter, but so it is. And in fact, Livy says, the high-spirited youth forgot the consul's edict, who had said that, because of all this problem that the gods were, there were these omens that the battle would have been hard and so on, had strength and discipline and, maintained, because the consul's orders were religiously guarded. So this was a sacrilege. Do you understand that? This is how far they were pushing the need of a discipline in this context, because they were building a civilization and they needed to enforce it, also ideologically speaking, and with force, right? And not only, says, the high-spirited youth forgot the consul's edict and the obedience due to a father, because the consul was his father. So that adds up to the severity. This is literally a crime, right? So consider that, according to the Mos Maiorum, the father had, right of life or death on his children, right? In Rome, technically. And so the youth rushed headlong into a contest in which victory or defeat were alike fatal. The rest of the cavalry, this is also interesting, retired to maintain spectators of the fray. This is literally a single combat. The other cavalrymen step aside to let the two dueling. The two combatants selected a clear space over which they charged each other at full gallop with leveled spears. Manlius' lance passed above his adversary's helmet, Maicius across the neck of the other horse. So at first clash, they basically do not harm each other. So they wheeled their horses round. So second round, second charge, and Manlius standing, and here whoever translated in English is an idiot, because he said Manlius standing in his stirrups. Actually, the term in Latin, here I could read the whole thing in Latin technically, but it's easier just for you to follow me like this, because in Latin it speaks, the fact that the guy, stood, well on horseback using his pedes. Literally that's the term, but in that sense it's the legs. It's the idea that these guys were without stirrups. They had hell of leg muscles of steel, right? Because that's what whoever goes on horseback must have, and especially given the strains, etc. And therefore they can't stand literally up just through pressing their thighs and so on. But however, standing in his legs, let's say better, was the first to get in a second stroke. He thrust his lance between the horse's ears. Feeling the wound, the horse reared, shook its head violently, and threw its rider off. Whilst he was trying to rise after his heavy fall by supporting himself with his lance and shield, Manlius drove his lance through his body and pinned him down to the earth. Quite graphic. And so radical violence, as it was, war is by definition. And how do you kill a person otherwise? And after despoiling the body, despolia opima, these in ancient times were literally, pieces of persons. Right, these were literally human sacrifices to the gods. So here it's meant more like in more civilized times the spoils, meaning not the corpse but the armament, things like that. After despoiling the body, he returned to his men. Normally the Romans would sever their heads, right? And the Romans were absolutely fond of decapitations, and that's something that was also because they believed naturally, as also the ancient peoples, that the soul stood in their mind, in the head, right? That's the same reasons. But I don't know, migration era, the Germans drank from their enemies' skulls, because and especially the ones of kings, chieftains, that were people who were, because they literally thought that the magic resided in their head, and so that if they drank from it, they would get the one of their, they would add up to their own for having killed them. So, and amidst their exulting shouts, entered the camp and went straight to his father at the headquarters tent, not in the least realizing the nature of his deed or its possible consequences. And this is the serious matter, that discipline doesn't forgive that. So it doesn't matter how brave you are, nobody gives a damn. It's like we were commenting the other day, the conquest of Transalpine Gaul. It's like when Caesar reproaches legionaries at Gergovia because they had stormed the Oppidum, but they had pushed forward without order. So he said, I'm proud of your courage, but I'm ashamed of your indiscipline. And this is, Livy was naturally Caesar's contemporary too. So don't think that these are just anecdotal things, but there were still values praised by the 1st century BC, right? So possible consequences, whether praise or punishment. So that this guy, it's not just because he was young, but because he was a Roman of his time and a warrior of his times, he, he knew he didn't have to do this, right? He wasn't properly an idiot, but he still did it because there was still so much pride ethically attached to the idea of winning, defeating such a renowned opponent in single combat, and plus on horseback, by a challenger that had stressed also this thing on the horseback. So he said that all may say, my father, to the council, that I'm a true scion of your blood. I bring to you these equestrian spoils, once again, the equestrian aspect, taken from a dead enemy who challenged me to single combat. On hearing this, the consul turned away from his son and ordered the trumpet to sound the assembly. The soldiers mustered in large numbers, and the consul began. Since you, Manlius, have shown no regard for either the authority of a consul or the obedience due to a father, Again, the two things are coupled. And in defiance of our edict, have left your post to fight against the enemy, and have done your best to destroy the military discipline through which the Roman state has stood till now unshaken. This is the important thing. The discipline had maintained the Roman state standing, right? This is deeply interiorized in Libyan times. At the time, this is a story, of course, but we can assume realistically not so much, because these things, individual fights would have been normal after all, and have, as we've seen before, when the consuls issued that soldiers didn't have to abandon their post, because they would normally do it to fight autonomously like that. So this is very important. You have to be able to read through the lines. And have forced upon me the necessity of forgetting either my duty to the Republic or my duty to myself and my children, it is better that we should suffer the consequences of our offense ourselves than the state should expiate our crime by inflicting great injury upon itself. We shall be a melancholy example, but one that will be profitable to the young men of the future. So this is the narrative of Livy's account, right? It's obvious. Rome made it first and foremost for discipline. Just think, if this history actually was drawn from accounts of those times that they said such a thing, how deeply interiorized was the effort. Now Livy is probably fabricating in good part this all, but by Libyan times, this was so deeply interiorized by the Romans that remembered, as this is the proof itself, that there had been a time which they had to counter that individualistic mentality of a warrior in order to make their empire existing in the first place, right? Their state, right? The empire existed because they were in part also individualistic minded, but their state existed because of discipline. So, in a way, what is fascinating in this story is that here the guy is not, Manlius' son is not depicted like a villain, right? He does something that, of course, should have not done, both because he refused, he rebelled to a consul's order, was sacred, and also because he rebelled to his father. So bad stuff, no. But the guy freaking did the amazing thing. He kills the Latin, he takes his spoils. He's the best, right? Yes, but the moral of the story is naturally that he has to pay for it, because before that comes the collectivity, and a sacred one. And then Livy says, my natural love of my children, and that proof of courage which from a false sense of honor you have given. False sense of honor. What honor is there to disobey orders? This would have been very difficult to understand for a 4th century BC Roman warrior, right? Move me to take your part, but since either the consul's authority must be vindicated by your death or forever abrogated by letting you go unpunished, so the consul had duty in that regard, I would believe that even you yourself, if there is a drop of my blood in your veins, the lineage here is important. Blood, really. This is the proto-chivalric idea of the noblesse with a different blood from the rest of the others, right? There is a genetic pride, too, in the warrior, the physical force in this thing, and that is moral at the same time, will not shrink from restoring by your punishment the military discipline which has been weakened by your misconduct. Go, lictor, bind him to the stake. All were paralyzed by such a ruthless order. They felt as if the axe was directed against each of them. Fear rather than discipline kept them motionless. Right? This is important. Fear rather than discipline kept them motionless. And everybody knows that discipline is based on that. Discipline is aimed at saving a person's life. How do you do that? You break the person who has to be responsible for it, and you rebuild it. Right? you have to strike fear, deterrent force. This is the one of humans are normally coward, right? If you threaten them, okay, if you actually beat them, they will learn, right? So they were scared as hell because the consul has his own son killed. So basically everybody could have been taken out much more quickly. And for some moments, Livy says, they stood transfixed in silence. Then suddenly, when they saw the blood pouring from his severed neck, their voices rose in unrestrained and angry complaint. They spared neither laments nor curses. The body of the youth, covered with his spoils, was cremated on a pyre erected outside the rampart, with all the funeral honors that the soldier's devotion could pay. So, yeah, he's tributed the funeral honors of a hero, but outside the rampart. So this is also a powerful idea. Within the camp, you can't accept this. There is something that is out, that military discipline does not allow. It doesn't matter how human, it doesn't matter. This is von Clausewitz, guys. Von Clausewitz says, the proceedings of war are not humane. And this is exactly what is meant here. Right? If you wonder in the history of thought, what these things emerged, how we rationalize, it did pass also through Livy. It passed through this memory of the Roman past and the obvious reality of discipline, how it works and what it requires, right? And this existed, by the way, in all the rest of the world. I mean, if you take, I don't know, the Gaelic Fiannas or the Germanic Comitatus, if you screwed up, you were out. First of all, you were no one, because in the moment you entered those things, you were not yourself. You were just basically a tool of the divinity, so you couldn't do anything by and this is exactly the dispersonalizing military experience of discipline. You cannot think to be a soldier and pretending to do whatever you want. You can't. You have to learn to obey blindly, even if you are ordered to get yourself killed. You're not a soldier if you then don't get yourself killed, and this is the only way to make things work. It is exactly the same thing. Then maybe you learn how to command. But first and foremost, this is discipline. If somebody, in those war bands we're seeing right now, they killed everybody every once in a while, right? To say, okay, who's the last that arrives to the meeting? Okay, you're dead. And he's sacrificed to the divinity. Human sacrifice. Yes, they did these things. It was normal, especially, it was normal in Roman archaic times, previous to days where Rome was something. But, if you had looked at Northern Europe at this time, it was done normally, because it was the only way to maintain an order in societies that had no state, had no center, right? And it was all intertwined with religious belief, because this was not just a secular modern idea of punishment. This is a sacrifice to the gods. Here there is the consul's divine mandate. The consul owns the imperium. You cannot hold the imperium if you even tell a lie. This is like the Achaemenid noblemen that were taught since they were little. Xenophon says, not to ever lie. Because if you lie, the glory of the skies that conferred you political military power took it away from you. And you were miserable and done. So a Roman consul could not go with his orders unrespected. It doesn't matter if the son had, it was the son of whoever, dead. And that is a tribute to loyalty to the divinity. Because without divinity, mortals do not win a good nothing. That's how you sublimate something in a world where you have to literally build a state, which was something before that did not exist. You have to make them believe blindly, faithfully, right? That's why today we don't understand these things anymore. They sound sadistic or stupid or whatever. If they hadn't done this, this is a story, etc. But these things happen for real, right? There's nothing strange. We know it anthropologically, historically. It happened, culturally speaking. The human sacrifice were a normal thing. So, Livy comments, the so-called Manlian orders, so were not only regarded with horror for the time, but were looked upon as setting a frightful precedent for the future. This is important because naturally they were extraordinary measures. Discipline didn't exist at the time as we intended today, was ad hoc, right? This happened also throughout all the rest of the ancient world, the medieval, even the modern age. I mean, there wasn't like literally a standard way of coping with these things. You issued such orders if it was needed or not, because also if you're too harsh, you don't realistically accomplish much in certain contexts. But this one was taken as a model. In fact, I believe it says terrible severity. It says the terrible severity of the punishment, however, made the soldiers more obedient to their general, and not only did it lead to greater attention being paid to the pickets and sentry duties and the ordering of the outposts, but when they went into battle for the final contest, this severity proved to be of the greatest service. There is an actual function to this, and as we were saying before, the consuls had already asked the soldiers to be more disciplined. The battle was exactly like one fought in a civil war. There was nothing in the Latin army different from the Roman except their courage, their valor. So here Livy begins the description of the Roman legion of the time. At first, the Romans used large... So it's an historicistic digression to make us understand what was the legion at the time. And it's fascinating that the same Romans cared about this stuff by the 1st century BC by saying, look, there was a change of our military system. We can't focus on it 100% clearly, but roughly things went like this. That's what they were telling us through Livy. At first, the Romans used a large shield called the clipeus. Afterwards, when the soldiers received pay, the smaller oblong shield called the scutum was adopted. The phalanx formation, so he's referring here to the siege of Veii, and he's mixing it, but things stuff. The clipeus here is the most of the round shield, typical, but the scutum, the italic scutum, is properly an italic shield. It was, similar ones were used also, I don't know, by the Celts, but properly the Italics had them in the same way already by themselves. So it was not a foreign adoption, as many people think the Romans stole things, but it's really not true. But by most, and especially it's not even a problem when you are capable of integrating certain things for other people. It means you already have surpassed that people, at least, or reached that people in that capacity, because you don't just steal things. What do you think technology of the 4th century BC was about? How many ways are there to make a shield, right? There's no special technology or exoteric knowledge behind it. It's just you have to employ it in a certain way. So absolutely here, any technologistic or mechanistic approach makes zero sense. But was already here. Even there would be some digression to make. Livy doesn't talk about that, but the various equipment of the various soldiers, as we know it archaeologically speaking, of the various orders, of soldiers, were different, we know, but let's simply stick to what he says. This thing is interesting. As we were saying before, the phalanx formation, similar to the Macedonian of the earlier days, was abandoned in favor of the distribution in 2 companies, the manipuli. So here, there is the idea that Romans, it's as if they had something like a phalanx, which here with I repeated this thing ad nauseam, but I know that somebody will listen to this video without having listened to the other. So the term phalanx in Greek is it just means it's pretty standard for any thickly compact infantry, for heavy infantry formation. Let's put it in this way. There is no technical information about it. If not the fact it was like a compressor. It was a tree log that smashed, the frontally whoever found it, and that's the idea. Here, Livy makes this step saying that basically the Romans passed to the earlier one-line formation into these distribution into the various companies, the manipuli. Now, also the earlier Roman army had this separation between the units because it was not literally a continuous line, right? But it was conceived in a less, in more unitary way than these more separated and theoretically flexible distribution, right? But don't think here the maniples did who knows what, right? It was still basically the same lines, and they just employed in different ways from before, in a sense, and trying to compensate, especially what is important about Manipular Legion is not much the fact that they have maniples as individual companies, but the fact that the formation develops in depth. I mean, the fact that there are 3 lines, that there are reserves, that you can make a progressive fort, right? And the Manipuli probably had a function also in that sense to facilitate the swapping that, as we were saying before, we don't have a clear information about, but also they allow to pass from marching to column into battle into line, so but we'll talk about that in another video. But here is just important for anecdotally that Livy says that this passage now has occurred, because we technically don't know with precision when this happened or how and why. There is no clear, historically there is no moment in which we can trace it, right? We know it has started happening from, we think, from after the Alia River battle 390 to this later, I think it's 314, 313 BC, when Livy himself describes what is by that time a real manipular formation. So things change in the meanwhile, but just we don't know more than this how, right? So Livy says the rare portion being broken up into smaller division. The foremost line consisted of the Astati, who formed into 15 companies, drawn up at a short distance from each other. These were called the light-armed companies, as whilst 1/3 carried a long spear, so that's the hasta, and short iron javelins. The remainder carried shields. So these were naturally the Romans still used spear as the prevalent weapon in the legionary infantry, and this front line consisted of youths in the first bloom of manhood, just for old enough for service. So it's as if here the Astati were characterized still in part as a hybrid infantry, not because they naturally, I mean, all Italic warriors would have basically a spear / javelins plus a sword of some sort. Here the difference he makes is between the guys with a shield and the others with probably either less javelins, or at least some less, some shorter spear. I don't know what, because it's not clear, but still it reflects, let's say, the fact that something was changing within these lines, that were not homogeneous like they would become eventually in the full manipular tactics, like the Astati basically in this line equipped in the same way, right? This front line, okay, we already read it. Behind the Astati were stationed an equal number of companies called principes, made up of men in full vigor of life, and all carrying shields and furnished with superior weapons. Right, so the fact here is clear. I mean, the principes were all equipped with shields, right, and had superior weapons. So the Astati were technically, in part, without at least the larger shield, but still provided with this, basic equipment that were still about a long spear in part, and javelins to be employed. But here it doesn't say whether the principes had it either, which was very likely, considering the nature of Italic infantry at this time. And let's stress, this is not the typical equipment you find in the Polybian Legion, right? In the full, which is already too advanced. Actually, let's say the one you find in the 3rd century now, on a regular base. This is still something different. So you can say, yes, remember the principes were but they were still equipped in a different way from they would be more homogeneously later on. Then Livy says this body of 30 companies were called the Antepilani, because they were in front of the guys equipped with the pillars, as we will see now. And behind them were the standards, under which were stationed 15 companies, which were divided into 3 sections called vexillae. The first section in each was called the pilus, and they consisted of 180 men to every standard vexillum. The first vexillum was followed by the triari, veterans of proved courage, the second by the Rorari, or skirmishers, younger men and less distinguished, by the third the Accensi, who were least to be depended upon and were therefore placed in the rearmost line. What is fascinating about this segmentation is that whereas the Antepilani were, so the Estati and the Principes were fundamentally, yes, there was an internal segmentation, but were considered all kind of the same kind. This last line that contained the elite of the Triari was grouped under the Vexillae, so it had a greater importance symbologically speaking, because these were literally the veterans of proved courage, so the ones in which the empire had somewhat descended on already. They had proven the fact that they were good troopers, and that therefore owned more religious, reward than the others. So much they were accompanied within the same vexillum by these lighter troops, the Rorari. They were skirmishers, basically would have been, say, the equivalent of the Velitas, but basically, right? And the Accensi that were still kind of, they're difficult to characterize in a sense, but they, as you see here, will be even employed as actual infantry. I mean, I can say heavy infantry because they were sent against the enemy Triari, so at least to Livy, these could hold the ground for some time, and in fact, that's what, they would be defeated, but still they made the work. So this reminds me just instinctively of the fact that the Triari here are somewhat accompanied, like this is a kind of an aristocratic idea that, the warrior that has already proven his courage and is more powerful, more rewarded, etc., has these field aids, literally, that the Astati and the Principes still do not have, right? So this may actually hide behind this passage from the, let's call it the Phalanx and the Manipular Legion, because there was a more aristocratic ethos and logic in the first compared to the latter, right? So the presence of the Rorari and the Accensi may be a relic of that. Then Livy says, when the battle formation of the army was completed, the Astati were the first to engage. This is actually already the tripartite battle line, right? You have the Astati, Principes, and Triari already. It's just you have something more. Here, if I'm not right, I don't know whether we skipped it, but basically here it says that the Accensi were an addition to the army. That is to say, while the Rorari were there normally, and that would make the legion more similar to the Velitas, the Rorari to the Velitas and the other three lines, just with the Rorari in this kind of auxiliary function to the Triari. The Accensi were this kind of throwaway infantry that was recruited in this case because the Romans were fighting against the Latins and they lacked numbers, because the Latins were fighting, would normally compensate for them, because fighting alongside the Romans. So the presence of the Accensi in the battle will be, let's say, the extra that will, through which at least Livy makes the Roman winning, because otherwise there would have been completely equal armies facing, and instead here there is this extra line that we'll use in a tricky way, and even more because Livy says that the Latins actually were getting the upper hand on the Romans so during the battle, so those will prove important, and it kind of stresses the importance also of the rest of the people in a sense, so it's very interesting. So, when the battle formation of the army was completed, the Astati were the first to engage. If they failed to repulse the enemy, they slowly retired through the intervals between the companies of the Principes, who then took up the fight, the Astati following in their rear. This is optimistic in the sense that when you break the first line, normally it's very difficult to gather forces to bring them to fight again, right? They're literally they're spent. Right, we've seen it in the Von Kriege series. There, you can regroup some of them, like mostly here it says behind the second line, but most likely behind. They're very difficult to regroup like that if they have the semblance of still a line rearranged in the best possible way. So here it sounds like Justice Sati stood behind the Principes, and it's interesting. I mean, like an individual support, and it's interesting that they wouldn't go as it would normally happen in in war, in other basically in any other context that I've come across. They would rather the first line would escape, and being regrouped, they would be stationed like in behind the wall formation, so behind even the Triari. But probably here the Triari were a bit posh, like they wouldn't accept that somebody would would stand behind them, right? They were the last ones to enter into fight, so much that here there is in fact Livy's passage, which is famously quoted of Triarius Retter, that it means when you arrived at the Triari, right? Because the Principes had fled too. Things were going bad, right? And the proverb went accordingly. But here, once again, we have to make an effort to understand what Livy was trying to say in this broader cultural sense of what the meaning of this legion in the Roman political and social order before the military one actually was. And he says, the Triari, meantime, were resting on one knee under their standards, their shields over their shoulders, and their spears planted on the ground with the points upwards, giving them the appearance of a bristling palisade. Why is this? Because their equipment was heavy. So they would rest like that. They would stand down. They would have the shoulder, the shield simply not hold, but basically on the terrain and leaning on their shoulders. Their spears planted on the ground, right? So they would be covered in armor. So that was tiring as well. So they were trying to rest, but at the same time looking menacing with these spears planted towards upwards, so that they would look like a palisade. Consider just for the record that a scutum weighs 8 kilos. I don't know, have you ever used a luggage with 8 kilos, trying to keep it in your hand? It's exhausting. So it's normal they would do like this. It's like when cavalry was mounted normally just before entering battle, because it would have been too exhausting even for the horses, etc. So never underestimate fatigue, because human body is literally nothing, right? It's so fragile and weak, and it's almost embarrassing. So always consider everything in terms of equipment, etc. in battle is very well calibrated, and you have to maximize every kind of, have to be fully ergonomic to be effective also in combat. So Livy here is not describing the battle, because this would be the standard way they would fight, but is still talking theoretically, right? But it would work for also the Battle of Suessa, of course. It's just here it is exemplifying how they would normally fight. And he writes, if the Principes were also unsuccessful, they slowly retired to the Triari, which has given rise to the proverbial saying, when people are in great difficulty, matters have come down to the Triari. Okay, when the Triari had admitted the Estati and Principes through the intervals separating their companies, where we talk about companies here, it's always maniples in the text, and they rose from their kneeling posture, and instantly closing their companies up, they blocked all passage through them, and in one compact mass fell on the enemy as the last hope of the army. So again, this idea that every line that retreated passed in through the lines of these guys, and this is interesting because naturally it raises the question how they opened it, and we don't explain it now. But probably they switched also depending on how they did, mostly passing from column to battle line formation. Probably they had some sentries that were half of a maniple that were stationed behind, and then the first one that formed the line, so they left a gap between it, and then they closed it again when they had to go to battle. This switching more than maniples, literally sentries to make the function work also from the front, like how they retreated. They also probably passed one sentry behind, and they would enter that gap. But this is just an hypothesis. It's just we don't know how it happened. Also, frankly, here Livy is insisting on the fact that the preferable way would be to retreat slowly, like as an entire line, and then passing through the gaps of the previous line to retreat behind them in safety. But this is also pretty optimistic in the sense that if a line is broken, but somebody will flee normally around, and also we don't know which distance these lines fought. Which normally, I mean, look at just medieval warfare, it would be at least 500 meters. I mean, they didn't have to cause domino effects. They were normal battle lines, like in all history of mankind. It's not that they were manifolds that were so complicatedly, interacting between lines and another. No, they would fight in the same way, as far as we understand that, right? This way of switching the line was just because they had these reserves in the first place. And they had enough collective discipline to make them move like that to substitute them in combat, right? Other peoples wouldn't. Like, think about the phalanx, the Macedonian phalanx. I don't know, they didn't have a system of replacement like that, because it was effectively a single line. There was nobody behind, right? And also they fought in a very different way. So consider the Romans here were melee fighters, so they also very individualistic minded still, and therefore fighting very individually, and still even later legionnaires would maintain that way of combat. There's nothing strange of fighting as a single fighter in a formation, though. That's what the Romans did normally. And which is true a bit also for many other armies and most armies, and what we tend to forget in this regard is that the Romans weren't fighting that differently from even these other peoples. Like, okay, the Romans themselves were Latins, but I mean, the same Samnites or the Italics or the Celts. I mean, the rest of Italics and the Celts, it's normal to fight like a single duelist, let's say, even in formation. Because that was the attitude. Of course, there would be ways to also fight information proper, like, in a very thickly compact array, etc. But we basically don't know anything about that, right? Only Vegetius and Polybius actually state that for the Roman army. In the case of Polybian times, there's a great space between a legionary and another. According to Vegetius, they're basically a phalanx, right? So what is true, what is not? Do you have other authors, other evidence? No. So it's literally all we know. There's no other, but maybe, it's just hypothesis. One can be better than another, of course, but it's just hypothesis, speculations. We weren't there. We have no other information on it. You won't come up with your answer where this is universally unknown by all scholars that study a lifetime on these things, and that know that these are the only things that exist for us to know as evidence. So it's not even a matter of deep calculation of experience. It's just knowing that those are the only two references and living with it, right? So Livy says, the enemy had followed up the others as though they had defeated them, so with dread and now and larger army rising apparently out of the earth. It's very punching as an image, because the triarii here are basically emphasizes the decisive line. Of course, they were the elite. So, yes, they are the ones that had to throw the biggest punch in battle. It's, even here, it happened in many other warfares. There's nothing strange, right? It's just the deal of a deployment in depth, and usually, but not always, that depends on what you want to do. The best is a bit, at least not in the first line, right? It depends. I can bring you medieval examples where, I don't know, in 3 lines that were usually the same, even when cavalry was prevalent, unlike here that is basically all infantry. I don't know, the punchiest line was the second, right? But also with cavalry, objectively, things do change in a way. So, but it depends also on what's the enemy like, would they deploy, and why, and it's not just militarily explainable. It may be a political thing. I remember in my master's thesis I studied, a king deployed certain guys in the front because they were politically, he hoped to get rid of them politically, independently from what the battle was going on, but also in part because of the battle tactics and where was kind of intelligent in a way. But still, there were also these other factors that are always interfering in military affairs, as von Clausewitz teaches us. Politics come first, and switches of light, of war, whatever it wants, always, and war just obeys, follows consequently. But anyhow, this tells you, I mean, the fact that Livy stresses this about the triarii, how much the Romans at this point had entered the mindset that it was normal to fight with that in-depth formation, right? With the idea that it was normally the triarii that really, there were always these three lines, right? And yes, they would hope, of course, the enemy would be defeated by the first two, but still, like in this case, they were fighting an army that was identical to theirs. So normally also in big battles where they would mostly use these tactics, etc., were very well balanced in terms of odds. So you wouldn't have a spare line that wouldn't join the fight, right? That you would have to make everything work, otherwise you lose. So this is also, practically speaking, what happens in the rest of warfare most of the times. And Livy says there were generally 4 legions enrolled, consisting of 5,000 men and 300 cavalry, were assigned to each legion. A force of equal size used to be supplied by the Latins. Now, however, they were hostile to Rome. So the Romans were fighting alongside the Samnites, as we will see, that we're not told in this case how they actually fought, but they had a different military organization in part. Livy says that the two armies were drawn up in the same formation, and they knew that if the Maniples kept their order, they would have had to fight not only vexilla with vexilla, astati with astati, principes with principes, but even centurion with centurion. So they were a specular formation, ideally. This does make a difference in the field, because as we were saying before, you have to spend all your forces there. What was best, right? Everything flattens to factors that are ever less controllable, let's say, in a way. So Livy says there were amongst the triarii 2 centurions, 1 in each army, the Roman possessing but little bodily strength, but an energetic and experienced soldier, the Latin a man of enormous strength and a splendid fighter, very well known to each other because they had always served in the same company. So, what does this mean? This is a topos that the Romans liked so much. The Romans liked to stress that they were basically physically inferior to others, but they were morally superior to others as well. The Latin here is what even later sources you will find, like with the Celt, with the German, etc. The big guy, the beefy, warrior, splendid fighter, etc. But not as valorous morally as the Roman that naturally ends in this. So this also generated the idea that these guys were so different anthropometrically. It's a myth. We know Europeans were pretty much similar among each other, and you can imagine a Roman and a Latin, that is, people that lived like 10 kilometers, 30 kilometers one from the other. How why would the Latin be have this man of enormous strength while the Roman little bodily strength, right? We can understand. Yes, the Romans maybe were more gentrified at large, but because they live in the city, the Latins were maybe slightly less civilized, were more tribal in that sense, but they lived in cities too. I mean, it doesn't make sense, obviously, right? So here Livy is actually making a topos that has to stress that, as we will see now, that the Romans managed to win the battle because they're more intelligent rather than more physically strong, and that is also actually a value of civilization, and this is objectively how civilizations are. Civilizations are more intelligent than others, that those were not, right? And without making a scale of which civilization was not, but it's obvious that von Clausewitz teaches us this pretty well, that, of course, in war, normally the most intelligent wins. Right? It's not a matter of strength or courage, whatever. It's mostly a matter of intelligence. Then also the rest is needed, but primarily you have to put the enemy in a condition of inferiority that at that point it has nothing to do with how physically, apt you are or how courageous you are, because those are literally some of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, qualities in war. can you pick an army, historically speaking, where people were not courageous, were not physically apt to the point that would make a difference on the field? It's ridiculous. Of course, wars were won because, somebody did something more intelligent and complex and better organized it, and could produce a greater leadership because they were also more intelligent people, more educated people. They had managed larger amounts of men and resources, and that's why civilizations are, in this sense, superior, because they pass through this, right? And that's literally why, tribes that are made up by strong and courageous warriors, at the end of the day, were crushed under the heels of these peoples, right? And it's always like that, because guess where we are now? We just kill people at, with a click, and where is physical strength or whatever, making a difference, right? We have civilized ourselves, and also largely through war itself that showed this, right? So it's not a surprise. Unfortunately, many people still do think that it's about courage or physical aptness, and that you wonder why this often, degrades into racism or whatever, because literally they have no idea of what warfare is. So Livy insists on this, says, the Roman, distrusting his own strength, had obtained the consul's permission before leaving Rome to choose his own sub-centurion to protect him from the man who was destined to be his enemy. This is fascinating, because it's as if it said, oh my god, because the centurion here is also challenged to single combat in a way, right? He was a figure that had to prove. Here centurions were, it's just in Livian time, under Caesar, that they began to be fully professional figures. The centurion would be similar to, we can say a chieftain in its function, but let's say to something that definitely had this dramatic individual capacity, but also, yes, physical one that had to be proven in this context as well, because still physicality was important. I don't want you to think that it wasn't, right? It's just that it was probably balanced. And this story that, they had to, the Roman one distrusted his physical capacity up to the point they had to bring a servant or whatever to defend him from the Latin centurion. It's kind of, I don't believe it personally. And, it rather maybe tells the story of these guys being still seen as the heroes, like, that in heroic warfare there is the hero and then the aide, like the squire with the knight, right? These things. So it may be this, but not because actually the Roman distrusted his physical strength, but rather because he was more intelligent, wanted somebody who helped him individually in combat, and or because they were also more demanding warriors in terms of equipment. They would be more active and so on. They would have to replace weapons and to bring beverage. It happened, right? This is a real thing. Maybe the Latin was, in this sense, more direct, less organized in that sense as well, and maybe trying to compensate physically. Who knows? In part, surely. These people in those times in general were obsessed with physical aptness. There was a certain athleticism that is also very well witnessed by the armor of the time. If you look at the warrior of Lanuvius, for example, we know they even just anatomically speaking, they were trying to show the fact they were true athletes of war. Right, they would make acrobacies. All of this also on horseback, because they were once again obsessed by this thing. Etc. But Livy concludes saying, this youth, finding himself face to face with the Latin centurion, gained a victory over him. Right, so the duo worked, in his opinion. So he passes to the battle proper. He says, the battle took place near the base of Mount Vesuvius, that, as we were saying before, has nothing to do with this, where the road led to Vesuris. The battle was actually fought, as we've seen, near the foot of the Rocca Monfina, right, between Minturnae and Suessa. And there's another locality that wasn't known as the one of Trifanum, but the battle here is probably meant not the one of Mount Vesuvius as you find here and there, but properly the Battle of Suessa. It would be today's, I think Sessa, Runca, those places, but more specifically this smaller locality. And in this, the quote of this is Salmon, page 208. Then there is colored in his History of Rome that talks about this battle, but it's really anecdotal, because literally, if you want to know what happened, it's just Livy that talks about this. So if you read Livy, actually everything, except, of course, if you want to look at what roads they took and all. There are studies on this, and Solomon is good for it. There are other references in the study, so you can check. But even the position here, it's not important because we don't know where the battlefield was, so nor there is any specific detail about the battlefield in the account. So Livy says, before leading out their armies to battle, the consuls offered sacrifice. The Aruspecs, whose duty it was to inspect the different organs in the victims, pointed out to Decius, who was the other consul, Decius Mus, famous for his devotio. In fact, his family were pretty much fond of this. We will describe in a while. A prophetic intimation of his death. In fact, in all other respects, the signs were favorable. So I said, the battle will go well, but you will die. Okay. Manlius' sacrifice was entirely satisfactory. It's fascinating that the consuls made two different sacrifices. It is well, said Decius, if my colleague has obtained favorable signs. They were loyal to each other. Because normally the consuls were also, competing with one another. Anyhow, they moved forward to battle in the formation I have already described. Manlius in command of the right division, Decius of the left. At first, so they had different legions on both sides. At first, both armies fought with equal strength and equal determination. After a time, the Roman Astati on the left, unable to withstand the insistency of the Latins, retired behind the Principes. During the temporary confusion created by this movement, Decius exclaimed in a loud voice to Valerius, Valerius, we need the help of the gods. Let the Pontifex Maximus dictate to me the words in which I am to devote myself for the legions. So he immolates himself, his life, as being come also in dream, and this initial and this from this sacrifice and so on from the Aruspecs. So the Pontifex bade him veil his head in his toga praetexta and rest his hand covered with the toga against his chin, then standing upon a spear to say these words. This is literally how we know the ritual happened, according to Livy at least. Janus, Jupiter, Father Mars, Quirinus, Bellona, Lares, Novenciles, and Indegetes, deities to whom belongs the power over us and over our foes, and ye too, divine Manes, I pray to you, I do you reverence, I crave your grace and favor that you will bless the Roman people, the Quirites, with power and victory, and visit the enemies of the Roman people, the Quirites, with fear and dread and death. In like manner as I have uttered this prayer, so do I now on behalf of the commonwealth of the Quirites, on behalf of the army, the legions, the auxiliaries of the Roman people, the Quirites, devote the legions and auxiliaries of the enemy, together with myself, to the divine Manes and to earth. After this prayer he ordered the lictors to go to Manlius and at once announced to his colleague that he had devoted himself on behalf of the army. He then girded himself with the Gabinian cincture, that was the one of the warriors proper, and it came from an Etruscan sacerdotal ritual, and in full armor leaped upon his horse, once again on horseback, this all happens like that for commanders, and dashed into the middle of the enemy. So he literally immolates himself, wanted to bring himself to hell with his death, all the enemies, right? And to those who watched him in both armies, he appeared something awful and superhuman, because that devoted has lost his humanity in a sense, and now belongs to the gods. This is what we were saying before about this warlike cultures, the brotherhoods, this idea that once you devote yourself to the god, you do not belong to yourself anymore. You're fundamentally damned, but you have made a contract, right? And you will die, but you will take all your enemies with you. And as though sent from heaven to expiate and appease all the anger of the gods, and to avert destruction from his people and bring it on their enemies. Those sent from heaven. Remember, this always descends in terms of capacity from the sky, and or from the earth as well. I mean, here this is naturally both uranic and chthonic deal, but still it's tied to the divinity. It's no human thing. And all the dread and terror which he carried with him through the front ranks of the Latins into confusion which soon spread throughout the entire army. This was most evident, for wherever his horse carried him, they were paralyzed, as though struck by some death-dealing star. Why? Because if they had killed him, they would have lost, and the enemies they knew that they would do that. So that is what it was. Like, you wouldn't want to confront with the deity. You didn't want to kill the guy. But anyhow, when he fell overwhelmed with darts, because still he was attacking, the Latin cohorts, in a state of perfect consternation, fled from the spot and left the space clear. And this is the point. The Latins freak out because they realize they've killed the guy who has devoted himself to the days, to the deities of war, and therefore they're done for. Right? It's better if they save their skins. And the Romans, on the other hand, freed from all religious fears, because now they had appeased the gods, whatever their anger was about, pressed forward as though the signal was then first given, and commenced a great battle. Right? So the Latins had been shaken by that, and you don't have to think this is irrealistic, that this is literature. These things happen exactly like that because they believed in these sacrifices. It was a common language. The Latins knew perfectly well what the Romans were doing here, right? And they freaked out. So the Romans had to exploit this from a psychological point of view. And I also think you find somebody who fights against you who is able to literally kill himself in order to make a deal with the gods to make you lose. But against which people you're fighting? I mean, this is psychologically devastating. And you freak out for real. And of course the Latins weren't that bad either. This is just a story in a sense. But they would do these things as we've seen. They were like the Romans. And Livy says, even the Rorari, so the skirmishers of the third line, rushed forward between the companies of Antepilani and added strength to the Astatian principes, whilst the Triari, kneeling on their right knee, waited for the consul's signal to rise. So this is interesting because it's as if the Triari had literally sent the Rorari, as we've seen that they were stationed behind the same Triari. So this sounds literally like the privileged veteran warrior says, okay, let's grant our, let's say, military capacity by sending these Rorari that are nothing like us because they're dirty skirmishers, they are scum, but they belong to us in a sense. If you think about the clientelary society here, that the broader meaning that this social, military, political distinction could make in a society like that. I mean, the contempt actually for any idea of human equality, or if not earned on the field as a true Roman warrior freeman, and this is the idea at the end of this. So that's why these figures are literally subordinated to this man, because they also in the city they are less. They can't hope to be someone. What's a skirmisher in front of a veteran heavy infantryman, right, covered in with the best weaponry and so on. I mean, this is what you have to read through these lines. But the sacrifice, the devoto, is fascinating, and he fulfills that. Otherwise, but Livy explains it afterwards. There would be another ritual that was at this point, like in probably more archaic times, there was no ritual. Either you died or you were damned and would die in some way. In this more modern times, let's say, the thing had been milded with a fake burial ritual with a statue embodying the guy that had sacrificed and so forth. Livy will describe it later, but let's come back to the battle. Livy writes, when Manlius heard the fate of his colleague, he honored his glorious death with tears, no less than with the due meed of praise. So they, of course, respected each other. Meantime, the battle proceeded, and in some quarters the weight of numbers was giving the advantage to the Latins. So Livy here insists on saying basically the Latins were stronger in conditions of parity to the Romans at this point. So for some time Manlius was in doubt whether the moment had not come for calling up the Triarii that, remember, would emerge as if they emerged from the earth. Here it's the Chthonic value as well of these guys, to solve the battle. And here tells you also the difficulties of a commander that has to enter the last reserve in time, and the timing is fundamentally here. But judging it better for them to be kept fresh till the final crisis of the battle, he gave orders for the Accensi at the extreme rear to advance to the front. As we've seen, the Accensi were basically the last third of the third line, right behind even the Rorarii, so they were good for nothing. Apparently they're sent against, as we'll see now, the enemy Triarii. That is also kind of challenging. I mean, Livy can have fabricated a bit the thing. But it's fascinating that these guys can also pass forward and to go to fight from the bottom of the third line, right? So here the Triarii grant other troops again. So that also signaled that the battle is not going so well for the Romans. But the Accensi in this regard, that is, as we've seen, were an extraordinary measure, because they had been called like a general levy because the Romans didn't have enough numbers, because the Latins had defected them. Here are the thing that the Latins do not have, right? Basically, the Latins have the same identical legion to the Romans, except the Accensi now. That solved the story here that Livy is rationalizing in a way, because it has to make the Romans win, and he just said that the Latins are superior, so how do they do? Well, the Accensi are the plus, as we will see. And Livy says, when they came up, I mean the Accensi, the Roman Accensi, the Latins, taking them for the opposing Triarii, instantly called up their own. This is interesting because, even in terms of distances, we have to think that these guys had to be distant enough to be exchanged for Triarii that otherwise would be very recognizable because of their splendid equipment, right? So, but the important was to trick the Latins and to make them commit to Triarii in their own regard. At least, this is what happened according to Livy. And he says, in the desperate struggle, they had tired themselves out and broken or blunted their spears, but as they were still driving the enemy back by main force, they imagined that the battle was decided and that they had reached their last line. So this is a bit realistic because, yes, the Romans had sent these Accensi, in theory were an extraordinary unit. So, but at that point, naturally, the Latin Triarii had realized that they weren't Roman Triarii, right? So, doesn't sound very... it sounds realistic if you realize that they thought they were the last line, in the sense that they maybe thought the Romans didn't have their own Triarii. And as we've seen, lines were distanced enough historically to... It happened all the time. There was a fresh line before that the enemy wouldn't see. It's not like in video games where everything is on plain sight. This battlefield's extended on kilometers. There could be... lines could be hidden, etc. So, yes, it is realistic, but just in that sense. And at that point, the Latins are supposed to have naturally spent themselves, so they were tired, etc. Especially the Triarii being heavy infantry, they would tire themselves more, chasing these lighter, apparently, troops. Livy doesn't say much about this. And however, that was they were disorderly enough, probably even chasing the enemy in a way, or letting others do it, but let's say not being ready for battle again. So then it was that the consul, Livy says, that said to his Triarii, "Rise up now, fresh and vigorous against a wearied foe. Think of your country and your parents and wives and children. Think of your consul lying there dead, that ye might win the victory." They rose up fresh and resplendent in their armor, as though a new army had suddenly sprung up, and after letting the Antepilani retire through them, they raised their battle shout. Battle shouts, they existed in Roman times. The Romans weren't just so silent and cold and disciplined. Battle shouts, especially in the moment of the attack, were launched. That is, maximizing them. The other peoples were more clumsy. Because they shouted all together in moments because they were just disorganized themselves, not having this kind of capacity of attacking directly in phases or with multiple lines, let's say, and having this all throwing out and less discipline. And of course, nobody had taught them to shut up at a certain point. So battle shout, especially at the moment, the last meters of the charge, is very important, very frightening. The Romans did it all the time, actually, throughout their history. And the front ranks of the Latins were thrown into disorder. The Romans thrust their spears into their faces. Little note to remind us how brutal certain things are. And in this way killed the main support of their army. They went on without being touched through the remaining companies as though throughout a crowd of unarmed men. This is actually pretty realistic, because when a force is spent, they're done for, so you can't push through them and break in them so easily. And they marked their advance with such a slaughter that they left hardly a fourth part of the enemy. So 3/4 of the Latins were basically knocked out. So this is literally the battle. And Livy adds, the Samnites, because remember, these were the Latins fighting against Romans and the Samnites. So, as you understand, Livy and his sources do not give much about the Samnites, but this will arise to certain problems later on. Naturally, the Samnites were wrong in their own story. But Livy says, the Samnites too were drawn up close to the lowest spurs of the mountain, were threatening the Latins on their flank, and so adding to their demoralization. So this is interesting, because what we can grasp, at least, is the Samnites might have tried some encircling maneuver, and we don't know how. But the fact that they would have been more apt to fight on, hilly, broken terrain of the Samnium, that it's a bit the stereotype here. We know the Samnites usually avoided pitched battles, but they were capable of fighting in them too, and they weren't so different from the other Italics. Let's be honest, especially at this time. But anyhow, maybe they were more mobile, more agile in some way. That they found a way to outflank the Latins. We don't know. We simply don't know. This is literally all we get. Livy says, the chief credit for that successful battle was given by all, Romans and allies alike, to the two consuls, and one of whom had diverted unto himself alone all the dangers that threatened from the gods supernal and the gods infernal. Remember, Uranic and Chthonic here. Whilst the other had shown such consummate generalship in the battle itself that the Roman and Latin historians who have left an account of it, that Livy seems to have known, are quite agreed that whichever side had Manlius as their commander must have won the victory. After their flight, the Latins took refuge in Menturnae. Their camp was captured after the battle, and many were killed there. Mostly Campanians, because the Campanians had joined part Latins. In fact, here I inserted also some pictures of the Latins, excuse me, because the Campanians were a bit hostile to the Samnites, technically, even though they were basically Samnites and Oscans themselves, gentrified Oscans themselves. So they basically had retreated into the camp. The Romans and the Samnites took it, and they slaughtered them in great part. The body of Decius was not found that day, as night overtook those who were searching for it. The next day, which speaks probably for a very bloody battle, as we will see, and as it had been, it was discovered buried beneath a heap of javelins, and with an immense number of the enemy lying round it. So the idea is that he had slaughtered them himself, and he had fought to the death. That gives you an idea of what the Devotio actually was, right? So if you wonder why he died, if the the enemy feared his death that would have doomed them, then it's because he was actually aggressing them. So you don't just sit there doing, oh, this guy's killing them, what do I do? You know, of course they would try to knock him out in a way or another. His obsequies were conducted by his colleague in a manner befitting that glorious death. Livy says, I ought to add here that a consul or dictator or praetor, when he devotes the legions of the enemy, need not necessarily devote himself, but may select any one he chooses out of a legion that has been regularly enrolled. This is a bit kind of a colorful note. If the man who has been so devoted is killed, all is considered to have been duly performed. If he is not killed, an image of the man 7 feet high at least must be buried in the earth, and a victim slain as an expiatory sacrifice. On the spot where such an image has been buried, no Roman magistrate must ever set his foot. If, as in the case of Decius, the commander devotes himself but survives the battle, he can no longer discharge any religious function, either on his own account or on behalf of the state, because you fulfill a religious vow. Otherwise, you're done for socially, politically. He has the right to devote his arms either by offering a sacrifice or otherwise to Vulcan or to any other deity. The spear on which the consul stands when repeating the formula of devotion must not pass into the enemy's hands. Should this happen, as Suove Taurilia must be offered as a propitiation to Mars. And then, although the memory of every traditional custom relating to either human or divine things has been lost through our abandonment of the old religion of our fathers in favor of the foreign novelties, I thought it not alien from my subject to record these regulations in the very words in which they have been handed down. This is important for Livy because the Romans did have a unique religion on their own. Roman religion wasn't at all the copy of the Hellenic one, and also considering that there probably wasn't something like an Hellenic religion or any other religion. I mean, there was just a set of gods every city did on its own, right? But the Romans had properly their own archaic religion. It was something way more primitive than, and way more brutal, way more similar to, I don't know, the one of the Germans or the Celts, etc. That they eventually lost because they boomed so quickly that this is the how the Romans happened, in a sense, that they kind of went past it before having a capacity of cultural resistance to the art. So, of course, they were Hellenized in a sense later on, but in part just, certain things aside derived also from other countries, but they also had still their own traces, but properly the rituals, the calendar. I mean, the Romans at the time of Livy still repeated these things because when they were written down, etc., but it's not that they actually understood them anymore, because they were so ancient. Anyhow, Livy continues, it says here about the fast between the Romans and the Samnites. Okay, they had defeated Latins, but they still hated each other's gods, and then they started complaining whose merit was the victory. And Livy says, in some authors I find it stated that it was only after the battle was over that the Samnites, who had been waiting to see the result, came to support the Romans. So this would be, some authors say that the Samnites actually didn't participate. So assistance was also coming from the Latins from Lanuvium that were actually siding with the Romans as well, because there were naturally different cities here, different communities, so not all the Latins were against the Romans. Whilst time was being wasted in deliberation, but whilst they were starting and a part of their column was already on the march, news came the defeat of the Latins. They faced about and re-entered their city, and it stated that Milionius, their praetor, remarked that for the very short march they would have had to pay a heavy price to Rome because they hadn't participated in time. Those of the Latins who survived the battle retreated by many different routes and gradually assembled in the city of Veschia. Here the leaders met to discuss the situation, and Numisius assured them that both armies had really experienced the same fortune and an equal amount of bloodshed. The Romans enjoyed no more than the name of victory in every other respect, and they were as good as defeated. The headquarters of both consuls were polluted with blood. The one had murdered his son, the other had devoted himself to death. Their whole army was massacred, their Stadian Principes killed, the companies both in front of and behind the standards had suffered enormous losses. It's important that Triari held the standards, and that they were kind of unique, even compared to those that came after them. So that to stress also the kind of not just the reserved nature of those troops, but also the fact that it was really the Triari that had the most important, even just sacred value in the army. The Triari in the end saved the situation. The Latin troops, it was true, were equally cut up, but Latium and the Volsci, there was 100 people against Rome, could supply reinforcements more quickly than Rome. If, therefore, they approved, he would at once call out the fighting men from the Latin and Volscian peoples and march back with an army to Capua, and would take the Romans unawares. A battle was the last thing they were expecting. He dispatched misleading letters throughout Latium and the Volscian country, those who had not been engaged in the battle being the more ready to believe what he said, and hastily levied body of militia drawn from all quarters was got together. This army was met by the consul at Trifanum, a place between Suessa and Menturna, this is where Livy actually comes up with the actual location of Suessa, that, however, he mixed cards with. This battle properly, and naturally the Romans win in this battle at Trifanum. The Latins are crushed, the Campanians too. So Livy actually makes confusion with two events, but they are actually the same battle. And he, I don't know, this would have been kind of a sort of way of making the Romans revenging for their heavy losses in the story. I don't know, it might have been an invention in that sense, but we just don't know. And then other information follows, but it's nothing to do with the battle anymore. I was glad, I was always fascinated with the Battle of Suessa, but I had never the opportunity of talking about it. And as you understand, there isn't really too much that we can derive tactically, if not instead from a military and, let's say, a military cultural point of view, that is, I think, equal, if not even more fascinating at a certain level. We see really a part through the Roman historiographical tradition of that archaic military ethos, very much concentrated on religious matters, on individualistic combat, mounted combat, etc. We see also this kind of proto-manipular legion is taking shape. We see definitely a word that is still forming, even the Latins are not fully framed under Roman control. The Samnitic wars are not over yet, so the Romans are still building what will emerge by the very late 4th century, as the Romans we know in the middle, let's say of the 3rd century, the more famous Manipular Legion, eventually the Polybian one, let's say, by approximation. This piece of information is quite meaningful in regard to these aspects. We can't really see what's like at the core. This is just referred. Livy's just telling a story that as we've seen here, he made mistakes, whatever, etc. Even in confused in other accounts, the dates, the events, the names of the consul. I mean, it did happen, but it's normal for a first century BC, early first century AD source to not to be so historically scientific as today. But what is extraordinary is what he writes, what he tells us from this other side of the story, the most cultural one, that at the end of the day we're more interested in, as you understand, because it's not separated from what we actually need to know about this warfare. But on the contrary, it's constitutive of it, and we should listen very carefully to what the sources have to say regarding to it. So I think this is really fascinating to read and to reflect on, and I hope I was able to deliver the exact concepts. And probably not you see that we cover Roman warfare frequently enough, but let's say not so in detail like we do with, I don't know, medieval warfare. And but it's definitely, we will be covering it anyway, as well as we can, and probably we will surely come also closer to this battle accounts, because that's, at the end of the day, what they're also easier to follow in terms of just there are few sources like this. You'll just read Livy and you have the whole story here without too many complications. And of course we know less in this regard, but at the same time that shows you more concretely what history is, in terms of not of the story but of the history of it. And that also reveals you, unfortunately, how few we know, but also how much we have overlooked in the understanding of these cultures, these peoples that are so important at the end of the day for many reasons, not just because the obvious role of Rome in Western civilization, but in world civilization, let's say, but in general also as a didactic example of how, we shouldn't be looking much for differences, rather for things, for analogies, because the world was much more similar to each other than it is today, in a sense, and it's simpler, and certain things functioned in more similar ways. And in a military historical perspective, the comparative analysis tells you exactly this, and this is exactly what makes knowledge and competence about military history. Not being dogmatic, wargamistic, kind of, categorical, but understanding that it was kind of a big similar thing, and that, it's even easier at that point to spot the differences where there were, but not thinking that they were, so decisive, we could say. We were explaining it, for example, in the video comparison between the Roman Manipular Legion, in fact, and the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx, that the odds are somewhat well balanced, right? Go look at that video if you're in the Roman warfare playlist. That is very important, actually. Just as for the sake of didactic example, because so much popular culture revolves around it, but doesn't quite focus what the problem was, because literally sometimes nobody even takes the time to read the sources and to actually try to understand what they are trying to say. But anyhow, enough for now. As you know, I like these topics because they're, let's say, they seem contained, but actually they can open a world to you. Anyhow, but for now we'll stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.